Well, thank you, Acting President, and I'm pleased to rise to speak on Mr Limbrick's motion, and I'm pleased to see that Mr Limbrick is enjoying some of his freedoms at the moment. But it looks like he's at an early opener nightclub, going by the red lights that we're seeing, bathing him in a beautiful, slightly pink colour. But you know, it's we are seeing those freedoms, and whoever thought that we would be having broadcasting into Parliament from a nightclub. But this has brought us many unusual things this year. Look, I don't actually have a problem with PAYAC continuing its investigations, but I note that Mr Limbrick does. I mean, he didn't even agree with the last PAYAC report. He wrote a minority report on it. So I guess if this is the idea of having another go and hoping that PAYAC does better, that it might say something that Mr Limbrick can agree with. And as someone who has been on PAYAC, I would certainly suggest that it is about answering, it is about asking the questions, but it's also about listening to the answers. And I think we saw some appalling behaviour on PAYAC, where we saw people with their feet up on the tables, posting to Telegram, not listening to the answers, not listening to the people that they asked to appear in front of them, the discourtesy. So I hope if PAYAC is doing a further investigation, that they do it with courtesy and with manners and actually listen to the answers. And one hopes, do look at the failure of the vaccination. Do look at the failure of Victoria being, right down the back of the queue for getting vaccines from the federal government. Do look at the way the federal government treated Victorian businesses separately. And in looking at the recommendations, from this report, I would say that some of the aspects of the new pandemic legislation actually go to many of the recommendations that PAYAC actually made, which was about greater transparency, which was about more information and greater accountability. Now, I note that in the new pandemic bill, that SARC will have a role to play in assessing the regulations and the human rights and human rights assessments. Now, as someone who sits on SARC, I'm looking forward to the extra level of work that those regulations will bring to SARC. I'm also pleased that what we're seeing in this pandemic legislation is the fact that we will finally see the health advice published. The assessment of the Charter of Human Rights that Mr Limbrick has been advocating and calling for now will be published under the new legislation. The reasons behind any orders will now be published. There will now also be an expert advisory committee, an independent committee, that will also be scrutinising the decisions made by this government, or whatever else they might like to scrutinise in regards to pandemic orders or the pandemic itself. So the new legislation is bringing in many of those aspects and many of the criticisms that Mr Limbrick has laid out in this chamber over the past month. So I'm certain that he will be positive about some aspects of that new legislation. I may be being a bit hopeful there, mightn't I, Mr Finn? But it's certainly, certainly if we want PAYAC to be doing this as well, I know the amount of work that we do in PAYAC. I know that these questions possibly don't necessarily need a separate inquiry. They could be asked in PAYAC. In the normal accountability, in the normal questioning that PAYAC does of each ministerial portfolio. However, if Mr Limbrick would like PAYAC to do this on top of the work that SARC is doing, on top of the work that the advisory committee will be doing, I'm not going to oppose this motion, but in looking at the recommendations that have come out of this, I'm not sure that this is illuminating information that we didn't already know.